Next panelist is Professor Arnon Lotem of the Department of Zoology, Tel Aviv University, who works on processes of learning in the animal world, including humans. Well, he's been producing astonishing papers recently, among which I found the generative learning, a generative probabilistic grammar of experience, a process-level model of language acquisition. So now you invade the terrain of linguists. Is there any linguist around in the room? So you have no enemies for the time being. Okay, go ahead.
Good evening. Can you hear me well? No problem, it will be even shorter. Sorry? You can turn it off. Okay, my name is Arnon, and I came here actually more as a guest, more to listen and to come to. I've heard a lot about you, and it was my pleasure to hear you give me this talk, and I know some of the people that you're working with, so it's. But I have to admit, I didn't prepare kind of a lecture. I was invited to a roundtable. Normally, if it's a roundtable, I say, well, I will wait and hear what other people have to say, and maybe I have to comment or maybe to ask questions. So I'm not going to give a lecture, but I have two questions. And I have first to say that I'm not expert about culture. I can say that maybe I study a lot of the foundation of culture, like many of the mechanisms, if you think about learning and social learning and the evolution of social learning and learning. But because I study animals, and mostly animal models, like we study in lab house sparrows, I cannot really say that, how much culture they have, or how much traditions they have. They have some, but not that much. But what I really want to ask, and maybe to ask Alex, of course I like evolution. I'm happy that people start thinking about evolution when they go to study culture. I have no objection to this. But I just wonder, how far we can take the analogy of evolution. Because for me, evolution is just, if you think quantitatively or mathematically about biology, then you come up with evolutionary theory. So we call it evolution. Now, culture is a very complex system. And of course, I can draw many analogies between evolution and culture. But there are a lot of complex dynamics that happen in culture that I'm not sure that I can make a very clear parallel between what happened there and what happened in evolution. And I give another example. If you think about people that study epidemiology of disease, like a transmission of disease, of course there is a lot of evolution. Okay, what do you mean? Oh. Of course, there is a lot of evolution when you study transmission of diseases. But should we need to have kind of a, say, evolutionary synthesis of disease transmission? It's true also for ecology. In ecology, you cannot study ecology. I mean, ecology always study very complex systems. You cannot study ecology without evolution. But do I need evolutionary theory of ecology? I don't know. I mean, we have evolution within ecology anyway all the time. So I'm really curious what is your perspective on these kind of things. And maybe I'll start with this, if you can just come and try to answer this. And if we have time, I have another question. But yeah, of course, this is why I'm here. Yeah, I can sit and you can talk. Ask more questions.
So how far to push the analogy, I guess, is a perennial question that's raised. I guess I would say it's not really an analogy, it's more a parallel. It's, as I was talking about in terms of Darwin laying out the basic principles. If you've got variation, if you've got some kind of struggle for existence, if you've got inheritance, then you've got evolution. Culture happens to have those three particular characteristics, just like biological change does, and therefore we can see culture as an evolving system, and then we can sort of, I guess it's not really, there's something called evolutionary epistemology, which kind of argues about the deep philosophical commonalities. I guess I would always take a more pragmatic, more methodological approach. It's the fact that there are these similarities, therefore we can use methods like phylogenetics, we can use methods like population genetics style models to solve the comparative problem and to solve similar problems that biologists are facing studying biological change, that cultural social scientists are facing when studying cultural change. So I guess if you want to put the question in terms of how far to push the analogy as far as, well, I guess as far as is needed to solve the same kind of methodological problems that social scientists face when they're studying cultural change, would be my answer. In terms of ecology and epidemiology you mentioned, well, so that I guess there's, going back to maybe what Eva was saying, you have niche construction approaches which argue that there is ecological inheritance, that ecological niches do evolve and co-evolve with genetic inheritance, and you can add culture in there, so you have a kind of 3 twin tracks, or maybe 4 if you add epigenetics, so you've got all these inheritance systems, genetic and non-genetic, so maybe my colleagues Kevin Leyland and John Odling-Smee would argue that ecology needs to be turned into an evolutionary science as well. I guess I would always, again, go back to how is that useful in solving a specific problem. And
you're more modest than Kevin wants to revolutionize everything.
I guess I would maybe be more modest than Kevin. He often argues that everything should be, well, niche construction, I guess, so maybe going back to what Eva was saying about developmental systems theory and niche construction, I kind of agree with everything that you said, Eva, and I agree with a lot of the niche construction approach, the ecological inheritance approach. I guess I don't find it useful in my specific research. Again, it's more of a pragmatic question for me. I guess I'd be more interested in that. How can this specific method help me solve this specific problem, to understand this specific empirical case study better, rather than maybe exploring the deep philosophical differences and similarities.
Yeah, great. Actually, in fact, first you answer my question. Yeah, okay, which you take turn. Okay, I hope that your answer also could help to other people to clarify this view, because with this kind of parallelism or borrowing methods, or see what is the different, just a productive interaction between the fields, just to help us study both. I have no problem with this at all. You mentioned niche construction, actually, and it can bring me to the second question, and I will use a very specific case, just maybe because we talk in general about niche construction, but actually we have to discuss a specific case for this. Let me ask you about conformity, because I wonder recently, because there were several studies trying to discuss conformity in animals. And one issue in conformity is that, if I study animals and I see that animal is doing what most other animals are doing, there are 2 interpretations for this. It could be a byproduct of a very simple learning. I will call it a frequency effect. Okay, normally it could be that animal evolved to imitate their parents, or to learn socially from the parents. So if they see an individual that doing, is always choosing red over blue. So they see it choosing red, they go and choose red. But if you talk about conformity at the population level, you're not talking just about the frequency effect. You're talking about a response that says if it's different. If I see one individual choosing red 20 times, it's not the same like seeing 20 different people choosing red, because then you have an independent sample, and the statistical power of this is much greater. And just wonder whether there are studies like in human society, or when you study culture, this kind of question of this kind of studies that really try to see whether the culture as a niche affected our, let's say, cognitive or learning mechanism in a way that you can say that they evolved specifically for the cultural niche, not only as a byproduct of simple individual learning. Do you have any?
Yes, I guess would be my main answer. So I guess maybe going back to the quantitative models that I was talking about. So those models of conformity specifically let you distinguish between, so the Boyd-Richardson definition of conformity is that you are disproportionately more likely to copy something if it's in a majority, if lots of people copy it. So for example, if you go into a restaurant and there's 6 people eating chicken and 4 people eating fish, conformity would only be if you have a more than 60% chance of choosing chicken. So it's even though you're just copying at random would give you 60%, which would be the majority, that's not conformity, that's sort of unbiased copying. So you have a specific, I guess the advantage of quantitative models is that you can define it in a specific way, this being disproportionately more likely to copy the majority more than you would expect by chance. And then, yes, lots of people have done lab-based experiments with humans where you get people to choose different options. I've done it with my arrowheads, for example, where you can show that under certain circumstances people do show this disproportionate copying. It's not just copying at random, it's...
But did they have any control for just frequency effect? Like if you just see the same friend eating again and again and again in the same restaurant, whether you learn the same method, maybe the effect will be exactly the same.
So usually I guess that's something you can play around with in the models and the experiments. Usually it's one person, one trait, so you're seeing, say, 10 people and 6 of them have one thing and 4 of them have something else. There are some studies with, so Daniel Howne at the Max Planck in Leipzig has done studies with kids, orangutans and chimpanzees, where he's looked at that. So one individual doing something repeatedly, is that the same as lots of people doing something once? And the kids, so with chimps and orangutans, they just go by the frequency. It doesn't matter if it's tied to the person, whereas if I remember rightly, the kids do take notice and they do show that it has to be disproportionately more likely across the population.
That's exactly what I was looking for, and I'm happy maybe to follow up on this paper.
Sure, yeah. But yeah, there's lots of clever experiments that people have been doing, kind of getting at these, what is what is unique about human social learning that you don't see in other species. There was a study in Science a couple of months ago, I think, claiming to show conformity in blue tits or great tits in Wyndham Woods.
Yeah, I know that this is how we started the discussion, because in this study you have no control for frequency.
Yeah, I think I would agree there. So if anybody doesn't know, they set up feeders in Wyndham Woods in Oxford, and the birds could either pick a red feeder or a green feeder, I think, and they looked to see whether the birds were being conformist in this.
Push the door from one side or another.
Yeah. Do the birds go along with whatever the majority of the other birds are going? And I think with that kind of situation, it's not a proper controlled experiment, so they couldn't really tell with any certainty.
Effectively, what they did get conformity, like effectively you get the same results. But from a evolutionary point of view, you don't know whether the mechanism is a specific mechanism for conformity or it is a byproduct of simple learning mechanism. And what you told me now about the apes, for example, the children, what I said is that actually in the apes, it could be a frequency effect that leads to conformity, and in the children you have some hints that maybe they do have a specific, either evolved or culturally developed or whatever, some mechanism that will distinguish between frequency effect and really like majority, not just repetition. Just kind of something.
Yeah, and your remark there about whether it's evolved or whether it's learned, that's another big question, I think. These biases, you can construct models where you have a sort of conformity allele and a non-conformity allele, and you do a sort of population genetic style model and look at when conformity evolves. But so some of my recent studies have been looking at British students and students from Hong Kong, Chinese students in the UK, and students from China doing the same kind of social learning experiments, and we've been finding way stronger conformity in social learning in the Chinese sample than the other ones, which suggests there's probably no genetic differences in these kind of things between people from China and the UK. So you can have a kind of learning of these learning strategies, a kind of culture co-evolution. You don't have to assume that these things are in any way genetic or innate.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.